Now.
On 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
It's 6:07. It's O'Connor and Company. Thanks for tuning in here on a Friday morning. Wrapping up a very busy week in your nation's capital and around the world. Coming up in 30 minutes, Enia Krivine, is with FDD. She's in Israel. She'll give us the latest on the tensions rising there after, well, it looks like Bibi Netanyahu's just said, you know what, if this Kamala Harris
the
is going to
gloves
be
are off.
Yeah, let's just go. Let's not wait. Let's not ask permission because we ain't going to get it. Let's just do our thing. 7:05, Peyton McNabb, Independent Women's Forum, talk about what it was like for her as a teenage girl to have to face off against a man pretending to be a woman on the playing field. And at 8:35, Brett Baer, Fox News Channel, really on the court, playing field court. You know, it's a metaphor. Larry O'Connor with Patrice Onwuka. Good morning, Patrice.
Good morning. Happy Friday, everybody.
It is happy, too.
Yes, it is.
So let's go back to this moment of this address that the appearance that President Trump gave to the National Association of Black Journalists. By the way, were you invited to that, Patrice?
I was not. I mean, I don't know if I would be considered a journalist, but I'm more of a commentator. But yeah, I did not get my invite. Sure. Yeah. I didn't get an invite though.
You should reach out.
Okay.
You'll remember that there was a whole question of, they're trying to make Trump racist for saying DEI hire, which he hasn't said. Supporters have, though. And by the way, last I checked, I thought DEI was a wonderful thing. And by the way, Joe Biden's on record saying that he embraces diversity, equity, inclusion. It's the most important thing in his administration, and it begins with Kamala Harris. So it's accurate to say that she was hired because of diversity, equity, inclusion, regardless of all that. Cut 10A here, if we could, Michael. This is Donald Trump also expanding one other question about Kamala Harris's racial identity.
I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She is always identified as a black woman. She went to a historically black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't. Because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn, and she became a black person.
Just to be clear.
And now, the Associated Press has fact-checked this. Donald Trump falsely suggested Kamala Harris has misled voters about her race. The person who needs to be fact-checked there is Ms. Scott, I think, Rachel Scott of ABC News, when she said she's always identified as white. Well, that's not true. That just isn't. There are plenty of contemporaneous occasions where she has either led with or exclusively identified as an Indian woman. Now the fact of the matter is she is biracial. She is half Indian, or I don't know what the percentage is. I shouldn't say half-half. But I know that her father is of African-American descent through Jamaica, and her mother is from India. But it's not false to say that if, it's like saying Barack Obama, just like Kamala Harris, is of mixed race descent, right? If he all of a sudden started saying, well, as a white man, it would be fair to say, wait, hold on a minute. For your entire public life, you've been a black man. Now you're saying what? Now, he could legitimately say he's a white man, I suppose.
Yeah, he could.
It's like my children, my children, who suddenly say, well, it's really great being a Chinese American. It's like, dude, your mother was born in America. You were born in America. You've got to, but this is a thing when you're in the business of racial identity, this is the mess you end up and the trap you end up sitting in. But I'd love to hear from you about this, Patrice, because there is a lot involved here, and I think that what's really this is not a racial thing as much as it is emphasizing Kamala Harris's ability to invent herself like a chameleon, depending on whatever audience is in front of her that she's trying to pander to. It just so happens in this case she's doing it with her race.
Yeah, there's a lot here. First and foremost, I implore folks, President Trump included, focus on hitting her on issues. The more you focus on her race, it allows her to escape from actually talking about her record and what she has not done or the negative things she has done. Mm-hmm. But if we're going to talk about race and this idea of code switching, this is where it gets really, really ridiculous and nasty, because in this country, you've had a group of black folks, the black elite, who have tried so hard to carve out this unique identity as African American. Technically, she's not African American. There's a difference between black and African American. Black meaning you descend from the the continent of Africa in some way, whether directly or indirectly. I am black. I come from the Caribbean, like I guess Harris's father, who's also from another island. But I'm not African American because my roots are not traced back to slavery in this country. But see, this is what happens when you go down this path. That said,
could I pause for a second there? Because
sure.
Here's what's so insane. You're right. Generally speaking, African American has been defined as your roots going back to the slave trade in the United States of America. However, ironically, your husband is literally African American.
Because my husband is from Africa, and he's now a naturalized citizen.
Right.
So he's American.
And by the way, and Elon Musk is African American.
African American.
But they're not considered African American in the way that it has been defined by those cultural activists who have determined what African American really means. But you're saying, based on that definition, technically Kamala Harris is not African American.
No, but you can call her a black woman. Whether she chooses to define herself or align herself with being a black person, I think comes down to whether she falls into the quote unquote the culture, and that's where I think there's really good footing to say she has not necessarily identified with the culture very deeply the way that some of these other celebrities or politicians have, and so it's in the talk, it's in the language, it's in who you hang out with, who you dance with. Right. That said, she switches up where she wants to, what she wants to emphasize in her background. And listen, it's her choice. She can be a Rachel Dolezal if she wants to, but she has focused quite a lot on being on her Asian, her Indian heritage, and then now she's really leaning in on the black heritage.
Right.
And so, I think that's where we call it what it is, if you want to call it hypocrisy, but that's kind of her choice. Again, to me, it doesn't make her better or worse as a candidate, because all of these candidates flip-flop and change how they behave in particular situations or depending on the person. It does make them seem inauthentic, like Hillary Clinton with her hot sauce in her purse talking to black folks.
Right.
And I think that's maybe what J.D. Vance and maybe President Trump were getting at. But I bring it back to my first point, which is hit her on the policies. There is so much more, because when you keep it on her race and gender, that's where they want the attention to be.
I absolutely get that. And I even said it yesterday. It's like I loved Trump's appearance, but at the same time, I worry that you give her ammunition, the less you're talking about. Mercedes Schlapp said on the air yesterday, if this election is about the economy and policies, national security, and the border, Kamala Harris goes down in a inferno, in a dumpster fire. If it's about identity politics, which is exactly where she wants it to be, then she has a chance. And so I am concerned that this conversation delves into and gives ammunition on that. However, you mentioned code switching, and I want to get into that in a moment.
Okay.
And maybe then that may be a term that a lot of people who are hearing for the first time in the last 24 or 48 hours. Let's expand on what this code switching means. I think it resonates more in the black community than in other communities.
Yes, it does.
And again, I want to reemphasize, this goes to her phoniness, her fakeness, her inauthenticity. In other words, who is this person? She's being thrust upon us without anyone being able to vote for her. If she changes who she is at any given moment to appeal and pander to whoever she's talking to, then can you really trust her with the presidency? That's very relevant, too, because when you vote for president, you just don't vote for policy. You vote for a person. So it is relevant to talk about who she is, not her racial makeup, but how she lies to people, if you want to use that word, through code switching. We're going to bring that up in a moment. First, though, it's 6:15, WMAL Draft.
WMAL.
Making sense of the news.
Live.
From the Home Paramount Pest Control Studios.
Home Paramount, the leader in pest control since 1939.
Yeah, setting aside the karma reference to her Indian heritage, listen, it's understandable, as you said, Patrice, that she has led with her Indian identity. First of all, she was 7 years old when her parents separated. She was raised almost exclusively by her mother in Quebec, Canada, by the way. She went to the University of Montreal. Then she transferred to Howard University here in D.C., historically black college. And maybe that's where she's like, oh, you know what, I'm also black. Let's really explore those roots. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. That could be, let's explore this part of my identity. Barack Obama did the same thing. He rarely saw his father growing up in Hawaii, raised by his white mother and really mostly by his white grandmother. In college, he started to explore his African roots. He visited Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, dreams of my father. We know the story. Okay, no one's knocking her for that, but let's not pretend that suddenly she's this historic black figure or African-American figure. Because, and I just want to get to, in fact, let me skip ahead here. Cut 14 quickly. This is CNN talking about this rising star, Kamala Harris. Cut 14. Listen.
My mother, who raised me and my sister, was a proud woman. She was a brown woman. She was a woman with a heavy accent.
And her mother, Shamla Gopalan, was also the biggest influence in Kamala Harris's life.
The answer is absolutely yes, Joe.
After the big announcement, Harris's sister wrote in a Twitter post, "You can't know who Kamala Harris is without knowing who our mother was."
Yeah, all
in
right.
1950.
And I do love this is a news report. This must have been a documentary that CNN created. Oh my God, the production quality here. And they chose to have a Indian journalist with an Indian accent be the narrator and reporter. Why? Why was it all in it? Well, number one, as I said, she was, as you heard, raised by her Indian mother. Culturally, that was the biggest influence on her life. But I'm sorry, I'm a little cynical. You know why it was such a big deal when she became senator to say, first U.S. Indian senator or U.S. senator of Indian descent? Because when you're on the left and you want to be a groundbreaking person who, is a heroic figure and an icon, because it's not good enough to just get elected and do something. No. You have to be a symbol. You have to break the glass ceiling. And here was Kamala Harris's problem. We already had black senators. Yeah. In fact, the first black
Carol
senators
Mosley
in America
Braun, I believe, was the first.
Republican. Well, no, she was the first black woman senator. We had black senators before that. They were actually, I
That's
believe,
right.
Republicans post-Civil War. Then you had your first black woman senator. See, she wasn't the first of anything. She couldn't be the first black woman senator. So it's like, oh, my God, I've got to be the first something. Oh, I'm the first Indian. So, okay, let's go with the Indian thing. Because that's when you're creating a persona about yourself, you got to do that. Now, of course, because of the politics of Trump, no big deal that he's running against an Indian woman, but it's a major issue if he's running against a black woman. And so that's when suddenly we hear about code switching. Here's Alex Wagner, who is of Asian descent, ironically, with a panel of 3 black journalists on MSNBC yesterday. No, excuse me, 2 days ago.
Overtly questioning her blackness. It's also going after code switching. Fox News has a chyron, this was from last night, talking about Kamala Harris's different accents that she uses during rallies. J.D. Vance tonight in Arizona says that Harris put on a Southern accent for a Georgia audience, echoing Fox. Trump tonight said the same thing at his rally in Pennsylvania.
Because it's true. I'll remind you, listen, this is cut 13. Kamala Harris when she's in front of a predominantly black Southern audience in Atlanta. Go.
And you all helped us win in 2020, and we're going to do it again in 2024.
All right. So, Patrice, I ask you, because I look at this and I see, who is this person? And by the way, we said this, as you said, we said this about Hillary. Hillary does the fake accent when she goes to a black church.
Yep.
Biden claims that he was raised in a black church when he can't clap on the downbeat, let alone the offbeat. Hillary says she carries hot sauce around wherever she goes. So we make fun of white people, and this is not about race. This is about people being frauds. And now they're not, when you're Alex Wagner and you've got an intellectual, Ivy League educated panel of black journalists. Oh, no, that's not being fraudulent or lying or inauthentic. It's just code switching. So help me out here. What the hell is code switching?
Code switching is what is when you change your dialect, you change your jargon, you change how you present yourself when you're speaking to a black community or a black audience compared to a white community or white audience. So a lot of blacks who are, in professional settings will say they speak proper English, for example, whereas when they're at home or around their friends, they might speak Ebonics, although I don't think people use that term anymore, but it's more relaxed. In the Caribbean, it's the difference between me speaking, again, proper English versus me saying wagwan here, which is just a dialect. You might not understand what I just said. I just said what's happening.
Whatever it was.
It's a dialect thing. Now, what Kamala Harris did in the clip you played was a little bit of was being a politician, playing to the audience, using a little bit of jargon and the way she spoke to seem like she's more black. To show her blackness, so to speak. But there's also something that she's doing differently, too, which is, I would say, shape-shifting, which is embracing more of her black culture than and kind of downplaying the Asian ancestry and the Asian culture side of her culture. And so that's actually not code switching. Code switching is really about language.
Code switching is is the difference. Let me put it this way. It's Will Smith, very, clear. It's the difference between Will Smith when he's Fresh Prince from Philly,
yes,
and talking, as a rapper,
yes,
versus
yes,
Will Smith giving an interview about his multi-million-dollar movie where
yes,
he doesn't play somebody from the streets. Will Smith can switch like that. That's code
exactly.
switch. But that's not what Kamala's doing.
It's not what she's doing. And listen, I actually don't even believe in this idea of code switching. It's used it's suggested that it's oppressive in some way because you can't be your full authentic self the way you are with one audience or another. Honestly, I think we all behave very differently in different audiences and with different people. If you're sitting in the principal's office about to be scolded, you're going to be on your best behavior and you're not going to be using slang language talking about, hey, dude, why are you rapping my game? I mean, instead you're going to say, sorry, principal, I didn't mean to do that. Thank you for pointing out the wrongness of my actions. That's not about race and it's not about oppression. But when you hear the word code switching, the motivation behind it is to say that somehow you are oppressed and you are suppressing your culturalness and blackness. And by the way, you are black whether you are Republican or Democrat, born here or not. If you're of African descent, you are black, and there's no adding to it or taking from it.
Thank you.
Bottom line.
Well, listen, this is something that's going to continue to be talked about.
It will
be. I understand the racial minefield that gets you into, and I do, like you, worry that this gives the Kamala Harrises of the world ammunition to continue to divide over race, and that might appeal to some of the whites. This has nothing to do with the black vote, in my opinion. This is the This is white suburban women who don't like it when he says things that make them look bad at their Chardonnay parties or on their Facebook pages, okay? And this might have contributed to those white suburban women looking bad, and so therefore they're going to put a sign out in their front yard that says, hate has no home here. Go ahead and do that as long as you vote the right way. It's 6:26.
Now
on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
6:36 as we plow through a very busy Friday and a very busy week in our nation and around the world. Coming up later in the program at 7:05, Pate McNabb. She's an ambassador for Independent Women's Forum. She is one of those teenage athletes who was seriously injured because she was forced to play against a male athlete identifying as a woman. We'll get her reaction to what we saw at the Olympics yesterday. 8:35, Brett Baer of Fox News Channel to wrap up the week in politics. It's Larry O'Connor with Patrice Onwuka. Good morning, Patrice.
Good morning. Happy Friday, everybody.
The Foundation for the Defense of Democracies is represented in Israel today with the senior director of the Israel Programs and National Security Network, Enia Krivine. Is it Krivine? I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Enia.
That's okay, Krivine, but you were close.
Krivine, thank you so much for joining us from Israel. And, as we saw the hostages released from Russia yesterday and the really fantastic, ecstatic families embracing them at Andrews Air Force Base last night, my heart yearned for those hostages that were abducted on October 7th, who no doubt have been severely tortured and I'm sure sexually assaulted. And there's still no word. There's still no discussion. And I want to start with that because we've seen a very aggressive but precise action over the last several days from the Israeli government led by Prime Minister Netanyahu to go after the heads of Hamas and Hezbollah. Is this a sign or a signal that the hope of negotiations at this point is completely lost and there is no hope to get those hostages back? I hate to even say it, but I'm asking you what the mood is there in Israel.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Yeah, Israelis are on pins and needles. There has been a hostage deal on the table since May, and there was talk just a couple weeks ago that it looked like this one might happen. But after the slaughter of 12 Israeli children on a soccer field last weekend, the stakes got higher here in Israel, and Netanyahu responded forcefully to that attack with 2 targeted assassinations in 24 hours, as you alluded to, one in Beirut, senior Hezbollah commander, and one in Tehran under the nose of the regime during the inauguration of their new president, is the assassination of a senior Hamas leader. Israel has not taken responsibility for that attack, that strike in Iran, but it's assumed to be Israel by many reporters.
I'm curious about, what is the expectation? Certainly, it seems like there's going to be likely attacks against Israelis. What has the government said for Israelis to prepare? What should they be doing? And is there any sort of guess about what that attack, the retaliatory attack, could look like?
So Israelis have been on high alert since the war began in October, and the guidance has pretty much remained the same. Israel has is set up to be able to communicate with its citizens very quickly in the case of incidents like what we saw in April when Iran attacked Israel with the largest array of drones, missiles, and UAVs seen on the battlefield. And essentially what happens is there are alerts that most Israelis get on their phones. There's a speaker system set up in communities so that there can be sort of ongoing announcements within the communities. And Israelis understand what the directives are. As of this morning in Israel, the directives have not changed. So we're all waiting to see what happens and how the situation evolves.
So there are some voices here in the United States and some elements concerned about the actions taken this week by the Israeli government against leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah, that this might lead to a further escalation, perhaps a war with Hezbollah on the northern front and the Golan Heights. I know most Israelis probably believe that they're already engaged in that war. And some are even suggesting that this might compel Iran to directly, rather than through their puppet terrorist organizations, directly strike against Israel. What's the mood like there, and how do you analyze that potential?
So what's been happening on Israel's northern border when Hezbollah started striking Israel on October 8th, a day after the massacres in southern Israel, has not been called a war by Israel. It certainly, to an analyst, it may look like a war. It's been thousands of rockets and hundreds of drones and dozens of Israelis killed. But they haven't actually called it a war. In Israel, they call it an operation, and they haven't even named the operation, which is part of Israel's way of defining this as a conflict that is not in full escalation yet. However, that could change depending on what Hezbollah's response is to the events of the past 36, 48 hours. There's a language in war, and there's a way of communicating. And right now, both sides, both Israel and Hezbollah, have said that they do not want all-out war. But this could change. And right now, Israelis are waiting to see whether this turns into the status quo before the strike on the Israeli soccer field that killed 12 children, or whether this takes whatever happens in the coming hours and days, takes the confrontation to a whole new level and potentially all-out war.
Just a really quick question. In the broader context, looking at the United States has been attacked, and I'm looking at your Great X feed here, that in the past 10 months, U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have been attacked 172 times, but the U.S. only responded 11 times. What do you make of that?
So I think it's contributing to the boldness of our adversaries and Israel's adversaries. One thing that unites the U.S. and Israel is we share a lot of the same adversaries. And the fact that the U.S. has been attacked over 170 times, and not forget that we've had dozens of our own servicemen and women killed and injured, and 3 of them were killed back in January. And to have this response rate of 10 to 170, I mean, that is something that's going to make our adversaries and our enemies feel emboldened to continue their policy, because if you look at the numbers, they're winning. It's working. And again, all of these regional proxies in Iraq and Syria answer to the Ayatollah in Tehran. So this is all part of the same conflict, of the same winning strategy of the Iranian regime to subjugate the region and eventually subjugate the U.S., which is their ultimate goal. U.S. is the great Satan and Israel is the little Satan.
Well, and finally, quickly, what is the impression from Israel about what's happening with our leadership? We had Kamala Harris, the vice president, acting as a de facto head of state, sitting in a formal setting with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was here after his, I thought, fantastic address to a joint session of Congress. Is there some concern or worry or even some curiosity about who's actually running American foreign policy right now?
I think that there are a lot of questions out there. And, in the beginning of this war, President Biden was very strong. In the early days after October 7th, Israelis were polled, and they had rated Biden higher than their approval rating for Trump. So he's doing great in the early days. But things changed. The domestic voices and domestic pressures in America, I think, weighed on the administration. And today, Israelis are not sure exactly where the U.S. stands. And that, again, not only does it make Israelis concerned for their future and their defense, but it also is having effect on the adversaries. Yeah. Any weakness from the U.S. is only going to embolden those that want to hurt us. So, difficult days ahead for sure in Israel, but one thing that we can be sort of comforted by is that Israel is the superior military power, thanks in large parts to the U.S., and Israel is preparing for any scenarios, and it's prepared to do what it takes to defend their people, which is the number one obligation of the government in Israel. So we'll see what happens.
When you can, please relay the distinction to the Israeli people, the distinction between the American administration or American State Department versus the American people. Overwhelmingly, the American people are still with our friends and allies.
Yes.
Thank you so
much.
much.
And that is certainly what the polls show. So thank you so much, sir.
WMAL, making sense of the headlines, because common sense isn't so common. Download the WMAL app to stream us for free.
An escalation now in the diplomatic standoff over the election in Venezuela on Sunday. Yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken put out a statement that said, quoting now, "Given the overwhelming evidence, it's clear to the United States and most importantly to the Venezuelan people that Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia won the most votes in Venezuela's July 28th presidential election. We congratulate Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia on his successful campaign." Interesting, he did not say the United States recognized Gonzalez as the new president of Venezuela. And I don't know what overwhelming evidence he's talking about, because no court of law in Venezuela has determined this. That's the standard that everything was held to here in the United States after the 2020 election. But that being said, obviously, it does appear. I mean, I'd be shocked to learn that Maduro, had a rigged election. So now what happens? What happens?
Well, I mean, we'll see. And another question is, how much of a hand will the United States have in what happens next? I mean, I think there's some discussion here, maybe potentially some backroom discussions with the United States. Apparently, I'm reading down here, President Maduro wrote on X that he has always dialogued. If the U.S. government is willing to respect the sovereignty and stop threatening Venezuela, we can resume dialogue. So we'll see. Well, it doesn't sound like he's going to be leaving anytime anytime soon or willingly. He took a page out of President Joe Biden's book.
Well, and let's not forget the dialogues that he's had with the U.S. under Joe Biden has consisted in Biden agreeing to lift sanctions against the regime, the authoritarian communist regime, if Maduro promised to have a free and fair election. And, well, look how well that turned out. It's 6:53.